So in this section, we're going to look at some of the paradoxes around individual versus social learning. When talking about the advantage of individual versus social learning, we have to think about some key concepts. First and foremost, cost and accuracy. Individual learning from an evolutionary perspective can be costly because you work through trial and error in order to come to a solution to an adaptive problem, and it can be deadly for you if you make a mistake. On the other hand, you're typically very accurate in terms of finding the right solution in case you survive. Social learning, on the other hand, is relatively cheap in comparison, but it is often depending on whether you pick up the right information from your social group. And this is what Roger talked about when he argued that there's a paradox between individual versus social learning strategies. As we just mentioned, individual learning is costly, but it will increase fitness overall. So the fitness of individual learning could be, let's say, for example, 50% here, right? So this is your fitness level, which remains constant, independent of how many other social learners are out there, and determines your fitness as the individual learner. On the other hand, social learning, where you start copying other people around you, offers benefits, because first of all, it's much cheaper. You don't go through the costs associated with the trial and error process of individual learning, but on the other hand, by just copying what other people are doing, you gain no information on the state of the environment, and so the information you get is not necessarily accurate. So the fitness of social learners is relatively high if you are the only social learner, and you can look around and you pick up traits that have been tested by all these individual learners. But as we increase the number of social learners, at some stage the information deteriorates because you have more social learners now than individual learners, and therefore the information may not be accurate anymore. And what happens as a result of that is we enter this area of an evolutionary stable state where we have a mix of individual and social learners, which is the optimal solution for a population. So as you can see here, the fitness for the overall population is highest if you have a small number of social learners, right? So the social learners, a small number of social learners, pick up relevant information from all these individual learners that are actually testing the environment, but it decreases once you go above a certain threshold, and then social learning actually decreases rapidly in terms of fitness, and therefore the fitness in the general population. So what we have to consider here, in addition to cost and accuracy, is also the stability of the environment. How much does the environment vary, and how costly could it be for you to pick up information from others? Because like the information might be outdated faster or more slowly in different environments. And this is also important because if we think about human evolution, the emergence of Homo sapiens took place during a time of dramatic climate changes, climatic fluctuations. So the environment was changing relatively rapidly. So environmental stability is certainly an important factor that we have to consider. So if we think about like the general problem, what is more important in order for a species to survive, cultural evolution or genetic transmission, culture transmission versus genetic transmission, we have to think about the stability of the environment. If the environment is relatively stable, and so there's very little change over long periods of time, then Obviously, genetic information is more effective in encoding the relative behavioral responses in the genome. You have relatively little errors in the transmission, in the cultural transmission, the social transmission, and therefore genetic transmissions would be more efficient if the environment is relatively stable. On the other hand, if the environment is very rapidly changing, then information becomes outdated very fast. First of all, it means genetic transmission is not going to be very effective because genetic transmission needs long time periods in order for adaptive behavior to become encoded in genetic information, first of all. And second of all, if the environment is changing very rapidly, any kind of information that an individual might gain becomes immediately outdated, and you're better off through trial and error work out what the best solution might be in this specific new moment. So culture transmission becomes, in theory, very useful and relevant in this kind of in-between stage where there's some change, but the change is not so low that genetic transmission would be more efficient, but it's also not so fast in order to outlive its usefulness, and therefore actually favors cultural transmission instead of just trial and error individual learning. So this also explains why climate change is such a huge issue for a lot of animals that rely more heavily on genetic transmission compared to cultural transmission. But how can we actually explain this paradox, this Rogers paradox, more broadly? Because if we think about it, humans evolved in an environment that was changing quite rapidly, and humans rely heavily on cultural transmission, cultural information. Yet, Rogers paradox would tell us that individual learning is actually as efficient in a larger population as is cultural information transmitted via social learning strategies and social transmission. So how can we actually explain this predominance of cultural transmission in human societies? And this is where very intriguing study by Luke Randall and a group in the UK came in, where they set up a social learning strategies tournament. So they used the idea of a one-armed bandit or slot machine or the pokies, right? So where you pull the lever and then you have a certain probability to have a hit and get a reward. And so what they did is they adapted this idea of the one-armed bandit to what they called a multi-arm bandit problem. So you have to imagine, instead of pulling the lever of potentially one slot machine, you have 100 machines that give you 100 different behaviors with different trade-offs. Right? So each machine codes one specific behavior, and you have a probability that this will earn you a reward or not. Then they also modulated the environment, so changes over time in the environment. And the way they did it is by changing the trade-offs for each behavior in each of these machines in a way. Then they of course modeled a finite population, so we don't have an infinite population. Human populations are not infinite. We have some size limitations, and obviously humans can die, and obviously we have a replacement, right? So they wanted to capture that in this kind of death-birth process. So each individual, in this case each learning strategy that people could come up with, had a 1 in 50% chance of dying. And this was based on fitness, which was the amount of points that you had earned relative to the number of rounds that you had played already. And then of course they also introduced the idea of mutations, where the effectiveness of a particular behavior could change. So this is the trade-offs could be changed across generations. And so now they set up this problem and they asked people from around the world to submit strategies, or if you want, like little avatars with specific learning mechanisms, learning strategies to compete in this game, and then work out what strategy, so what avatar with what kind of learning, social learning strategy would work best. And so they also limited or regulated, and this is the important part, the types of behaviors or the types of strategies that any of these avatars or learning strategies could do. So the first one is you can innovate. So this is asocial learning. So you have individual rounds where you can do something, and one option is you innovate. So this asocial learning, you have a direct interaction with the environment, so it's trial and error learning. And so this is costly because you don't know what you get, but what you get is accurate because it accurately reflects the current state of the environment. So you have accurate information about the payoff. Then a second strategy that they implemented in their system is observe. This is similar to social learning or copying of behavior performed by others, but the problem is it is noisy. So it can happen that if you decide to play observe, that you don't observe any behavior at all because everyone else at that moment is observing or innovating in this case, but innovation means you would not at that moment see the outcome of the innovation. The second reason why it is noisy, it might happen that you observe somebody who already shows a behavior that you have in your repertoire. And then finally they added some error components, so you could actually observe the wrong payoff. And then importantly they also had the option of exploit, so applying any learned strategy that you have in your repertoire in order to gain points. And this is the only way to gain points. So to summarize this and just reiterate the main points, these researchers set up a tournament where they asked people to submit strategies that would come up with the optimal balance between innovation, observation, and exploitation to see what is the optimal ratio for increasing fitness at the population level. And they also restricted, so you have a number of rounds, and in each round you have to choose between one strategy, either innovate or observe or exploit. You can't run two of strategies at the same time. And they were interested in finding out which combination of these and would be most efficient and how you actually decide when to do what. And so they advertised this, and over 100 groups and individuals submitted their solutions. And then they had two different rounds, one where you had pairs of these avatars with these different combinations of strategies going against each other, and then you would have a final melee where everyone that made it through that first round would play with everyone. And of these over 100 contributions, one algorithm really stood out, which was called Discount Machine, which really was beating all the other ones hand down. Interestingly, one thing that if you think about it is actually so cool. Two high school students actually submitted an algorithm, and their algorithm was among the top 10 algorithms. And you have to think about this. So two high school students came up with an algorithm that was beating a lot of the algorithms proposed by these very esteemed professors, and researchers at renowned universities worldwide. And so it just shows, that in creativity can be really cool and doesn't actually know any boundaries in terms of like where you come up with your cool ideas. So let's have a look what actually made this count machine so different, and those algorithms that actually progressed to the final million and came up at the top. What are the key insights? So what they did is now the researchers had all these algorithms, they had all their behaviors, and they could now start understanding what was actually going on and what is effective. And they had a couple of key insights from this tournament. The first one, and very surprising in a way, from Rogers, if you think about Rogers' paradox, is that if you decide to learn, observing, so social learning is actually more effective than innovation. So the proportion of observe, playing observe when learning was actually way more effective for fitness overall compared to innovate, so trial and error individual learning. The first thing really is, if you need to learn, observe others. That's your best strategy. The second observation is learning too much is actually costly. And this is something that Kevin Lyland, as the senior author in a recent book, emphasized. The best strategy to survive is actually to do something rather than sit and watch. You have to exploit your environment. And he said it's actually, and if you think about it, it's quite humbling. If we think about the university setting and you guys going through your university degree, in a way, in life you only get ahead or you get to something if you apply what you learn. So application of learning is key, and there's actually, evolutionary speaking, a cost for too much time spent on learning. And the second component related to this is also the timing. Learning too long, so spending too much time observing others instead of actually applying what you have learned, is costly. So the algorithms that were more effective typically had a few rounds, 1 or 2 rounds of observing others, and then immediately started applying what they had learned. So this was much better for increasing fitness of these avatars or algorithms compared to trying to learn for too long. So timing of learning is key. And a further insight is, if a strategy works, don't learn. That was one of the insights from that tournament, that if you found something that gives you rewards, stick with it. Don't try and see if there's something else that might work better. It's similar to the good old saying, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. Right? So those avatars or algorithms that spaced out learning in between exploit rounds were doing much better, instead of those algorithms or avatars that had relatively strong bias towards learning. So playing exploit was much more effective again. And finally, it's adaptive learning. When should you learn? And the most effective strategies were very specific in terms of when they actually switch to a learning strategy, either observe or innovate, and typically observe was much better. And that is when your trade-off for the individual strategies drops. So what you can see here is, on one hand, the average lifetime payoff, so how the overall fitness, and over here the proportion of learning moves. So what you can see, as the fitness goes down, effective algorithms started switching to a learning mode, and then you improve your fitness again, and as it goes down you start switching to learning. So adaptive learning. Start learning when the environment changes, and the best way you can find out about it is by seeing that your behavior that you applied previously is not giving you the same kind of benefits or rewards anymore. And so that is already a couple of major insights, but there are also a couple of other features that made discount machine slightly different from other avatars or algorithms, and also some of the other winning machines. So one thing that with discount machine and the other top learning algorithms, there was nearly exclusive reliance on observing. So there is very little individual learning. But they kept learning to a minimum, but tended to spread it out across time. So learning repeatedly over time as the environment was changing. The winning algorithm also was unique in that it relied more heavily on recently acquired information. So it was discounting older information. So this basically assumes that the environment is changing constantly, and the older the information is, the less likely you should rely on it, or the less likely it is to be accurate, so you should rely on it less. And also discount machine had a unique way of looking at the rewards gained over time and the observations that the algorithm gained from others, and then estimating what would be the expected future payoff. So trying to work out what the environment was like and where it was heading. And so from an evolutionary perspective, this is actually really important because it links to core human features like mental time travel. So we can actually solve Rogers' paradox by integrating all this information. The Rogers paradox assumed that learners or social learners actually copy indiscriminately. But if you think about it, in this tournament, you wanted to gain points, right? So you're a rational actor. So you're going to display the most effective behavior in order to gain points, in order to get ahead of others. And so therefore others can observe what is actually working, right? So you typically display the highest paying behavior, and this can be copied by others. So this helps us to overcome this paradox by focusing on the importance of strategic social learning. You have to copy the information that is actually effective in a specific environment. So summary to social learning strategies and the paradoxes around here. We have to consider cost, accuracy, and the environmental stability. And Rogers' paradox really focuses on this kind of trade-off between individual learning, innovation, trial and error learning, versus social learning, so copying, imitating, etc. But what this social strategies tournament by the British group showed was it is important to consider this strategic point of social learning. You have to copy adaptive behavior, and since people or agents are typically relatively rational, you can get information on what actually works within an environment and start copying it. Right? So some key insights that we have gained about the importance of social learning and how and when it is actually adaptive.